Hello, and welcome to Chrysalis Conversations. This is the second of the 2020 series of conversations, continuing our discovery about the power of women's movements. I'm Alex Sachs of KCCI News, and on behalf of the Chrysalis Foundation, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Wherever you are, we appreciate you taking time to be with us as we learn more about the remarkable work of women in our community, society, and our world. Chrysalis is proud to partner with the League of Women Voters of Metro Des Moines in presenting the 2020 Chrysalis Conversations series. And during our first conversation, we marked the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. We learned about how, through persistence, women were able to achieve suffrage, a right we enjoy and exercise today. But the conversations continue, and today we'll learn about the essential elements that go into changing our rights and freedoms. Hashtag activism, people power, and generational change are today's topics. And we'll learn from two women experts about the qualities, characteristics, and consequences of women working together in an effort to shape their roles in our society. Women's movements have changed history and continue to do so. Whether you lived during women's liberation in the 1960s, took part in the first Women's March in 2017, or you use social media and the tools including hashtag #MeToo, you know the power and the pace of these efforts. So let's go ahead and turn it over to Terry Hernandez to introduce our two speakers in this remarkable conversation.
Thank you, Alex. Dr. Rachel Payne Caulfield is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Drake University. Originally from New York, Dr. Caulfield came to Iowa in 2001 via Washington, D.C., where she was a research fellow for the Brookings Institution, after she earned a PhD at George Washington University. An enthusiast of the Iowa caucuses, Dr. Caulfield founded the Iowa Caucus Project at Drake in 2007, and she chairs Drake's political visitor team, organizing logistics for campaign and media events. She's led campus efforts to host national presidential debates and candidate visits, and published her book, The Iowa Caucus: Images of Modern America, in 2016. Recognized as Honors Teacher of the Year in 2005 and the Madeline M. Levitt Teacher of the Year in 2019, Dr. Caulfield received the College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Engagement Award in 2012 and was named Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teacher of the Year in 2014. As the first tenured African-American woman in the history of Grinnell College, Dr. Keisho Scott is Associate Professor of American Studies and Sociology. She is an internationally renowned diversity trainer and consultant and was the founding member of International Capacity Building Services, conducting human rights workshops and training programs, serving as keynote speaker, spokeswoman, and participant in a range of professional workshops and events, including the first International Women's Studies and Gender Studies Conference in China. She won a Fulbright Fellowship to teach, research, and write in Ethiopia. Dr. Scott was named Iowa Woman of the Year. She's won the American Book Award in 1988 for her book, Tight Spaces. She received the Human Rights Award in 1991 for her book, The Habit of Survival: Black Women in America, and received the Christine Wilson Medal for Equality and Justice from the Iowa Commission on the Status of Women in 2008, and was inducted into the Iowa African American Hall of Fame in 2016. Dr. Scott has appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show, Sonia Live, and CNN. We'll enjoy their conversation.
Hello.
Hello.
So we have been properly introduced, so we can start this conversation.
Exactly right.
That's right. But let's let them know that we are practicing social distancing. We are unmasking ourselves voluntarily.
For today, only. For this brief period today, to have a conversation.
You bet. So we want to tell a little academic joke, right? We were asked to be, by the executive director of the Chrysalis Foundation, Terry Fernandez, to talk about social movements, and she sent us an outline, which was outstanding, actually. Yes. But it was kind of like a whole course that would take 16 weeks, and we laughed.
That's right.
But we loved her enthusiasm, and we are going to curtail our remarks to sort of frame what we think are some of the highlights of understanding the way in which social movements impact our world.
That's right.
So I'm going to start out with what I call this kind of mini lecture, right? Sort of the key points, and you can step in anytime you want to.
Absolutely.
So here's the deal. If you're going to talk about social movements, you and I both know that we have to have a definition. So I'm going to give you the broadest one I can. Social movements is when a number of people, a larger number of people, and often sometimes significant people, move to make change or resist change. Social movements are not linear, so that you can have a change in one direction and an equal and opposite movement change in the same direction, right? Going another way. So we wanted to start out by saying, if we have that definition of social movements doing that and not being only progressive social movements, there could be movements that are not progressive. That means you have social movements themselves, you have social movement organizations, and you have social movement individuals.
That's right, absolutely. And I think one of the really interesting things that we're seeing right now is that social movements have taken on a role in our political sphere, and they always have, right? Social movements have always been such dominant drivers of political change. But I think we're at a moment right now where most average Americans are paying attention to social movements in a way that they haven't perhaps in the past. And they're participating, particularly in networked movements. This idea that you can now participate in a movement while at home, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So the barriers to entry have gone down. And so that collective action, that idea of all these people coming together, these like-minded people coming together, that really facilitates that level of engagement that perhaps most Americans aren't familiar with or haven't seen in their lifetimes or haven't felt a part of in their lifetimes yet.
Absolutely. Generally, when we teach social movements, you and I know that social movements intersect. So the civil rights movement can also intersect with the women's movement over a period of time. And we know that they also speak to each other. And sometimes people are in multiple social movements simultaneously. But here's my favorite part. Social movements have been institutionalized to this extent. The right to participate is part of the democratic experiment. And so you can have societies where they don't permit social change. In most advanced democracies, we allow people to participate in a change process.
And I think this is one of the really interesting things as well about this idea of networked movements. The idea that people can participate from near and far. And you can find like-minded people, not just down the street, not just in your immediate community, but you can now find people across the globe who share a certain conceptualization of change, and they can come together in virtual space and find each other in a way that they haven't been able to in the past. I know you've particularly focused on some of the global elements and the globalization of social movements.
I'm going to talk about that.
There you go.
So let me lay out 4 more key points, and then we're going to jump into that. One, social movements are, and you know this, we want them to know this,
that's right.
is that they are sometimes top-down. So for an example, the successful smoking cessation movement was a movement in which this larger elements of society participated in saying we need to shut this smoking down, right? But also social movements are bottom-up. And sometimes they intersect in interesting places. So when we look at this particular COVID-19 moment that we're in, we can see how some of the movements are coming from both places, right? Second of all, social movements have to be intergenerational, we know, for there to be success, because we study them in a large context. So when you have the youth and you have their parent generation and you have the grandparent generation, you more than likely will have successful social movements. And I think one of the things you pointed out to me is that there, in any of the features so far, there's always the personal is political, right?
Always.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. I think the other thing is you've already mentioned and alluded to the fact that they're face-to-face, and yet we're now at a moment where we're learning how they will be virtual. Oh, my goodness.
Changes everything.
Changes everything. And how might some of those changes become institutional and not just an adaptation for that moment? So we're going to see that, and we'll allude to that. And the other thing is that social movements are absolutely intersectional. I'm looking at my notes because that's what the popular society calls identity politics.
Right.
But when we think in terms of racism and sexism and homophobia and classism and disabilities and colonial states and all of those things, you have to look at the constituencies that have been involved and the people being involved in a way where they hopefully want to move their particular interests forward based on the identities they choose. That's it.
Yeah, and some of those, the heightening of conversations about intersectionality has been so important, particularly for the women's movement, in recognizing some of the perhaps challenges that the women's movement writ large has faced over several decades now, right? And this kind of fracturing among different affiliated identities within the women's movement. And when you just try to put all these people into a single movement and assume that there are similar underlying concerns and that divergent concerns that are unique to one particular chosen identity, that those aren't going to take center stage, right? And so you could look at the fractures that appear, and they appear in almost any social movement over time, and certainly in the women's movement. I think we also, right now, for example, we're seeing a fracture among some of the generational, right, the generations, and how young women conceptualize their place in society, what they want their society to look like, the kinds of tools that they're willing to engage from movement activism. Those are all very different than their parents or their grandparents. And so that generational coming together can pose a real challenge as well, if there's not common agreement, and certainly if there's not a built-in institutionalized mechanism to solve some of those disagreements.
Absolutely. In as much as we have given them our 101,
yes.
all right, our social movement 101 terms and tools, the thing that we want to do now is for you to know that we're not here to spend our time talking about what isn't working for women.
Yep.
We want to talk about what is working for women's social movements. But we also want to do that within the framework of the larger idea of we're in this historical moment.
That's right.
So let me get to one of the things that you wanted me to specifically talk about, and that is how movements become transnational. Let me just quickly define that. That is, when you have an issue that crosses borders, that is, it can cross a city border, it can cross a state border, it can cross a national border. So when you look at something like Black Lives Matter, for an example, which began in Ferguson, Missouri, we now have Black Lives Matter organizations, individual leaders, and institutional policies in almost 80 countries all over the world. So when an issue crosses boundaries like that, and borders like that, cultural and political borders, it's a transnational movement. And of course, one of the more popular ones has to be the Me Too movement. So I think that we're going to see how this COVID moment that we're living in is crossing borders back and forth. And by the way, I just want to say, if something's transnational, it means it goes two ways. It can start in India and have an impact on the United States. It can start in China and have an impact on the United States. It can start in the United States and have an impact anywhere in the world.
And so many of our pressing contemporary problems are transnational.
That's right.
And our focus is increasingly transnational.
Absolutely.
Our political identities are increasingly transnational. We think of ourselves as not just citizens of our town or citizens of our state, but of citizens of the world, right?
Absolutely.
And we're much more aware of the interconnectedness of our lives with the lives of people we've never met before. But we're also aware of the connectedness of things like, climate change and a pandemic, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I would
and
say
rights
so.
discourses all over
Yes.
the world now. We're paying attention in a way that perhaps we have not in the past. But that's also facilitated, again, by those networks, and particularly virtual networks that allow us to gather information very quickly, to learn from each other, to see what sorts of tactics are working in one space, and find out how they might apply to our own space.
I think of that Ronald Reagan statement that we're in a new world order in the 90s.
That's right.
And so we know that in the background of any social movement is also the context, the economic context. So we now live in a world global system of capitalism. And we live in an advanced capitalist moment where many of the countries in the world are operating out of those principles. So that means that some of the solutions for solving them will have implications for capitalism, and some of the tenets of capitalism will be obstacles to some of those solutions.
Exactly.
So we're looking at women's movements within that context too.
Yeah. And I think it's always important for us to be thinking in terms of, we don't want to think only in terms of challenges.
Right.
But oftentimes when we think about tactics and tools for success, we have to think about how those tools are going to help us overcome hurdles. And so I think one of the things that I'm really kind of interested in moving forward in terms of thinking about how women are coming together to identify changes that they want to make within their immediate communities, but also within their global networks. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is what are those hurdles? How do we overcome them? And as a political scientist, we spend a lot of time conceptualizing any sort of endeavor in terms of collective action difficulties and what are the institutional challenges that you're going to face in terms of bringing people together into common cause.
I like the way that we're together because we've been trained in a way where you have those 5 questions that you political scientists ask, and we have those 5 questions that a sociologist asks. One of those questions for political scientists has to do with how is power conceptualized and how does it work? And as sociologists, we're asking the question of what is that human behavior that's in the group? So when I think about the successes of social movements, just by sheer fact that people start out with a common grievance and they respond to a particular incident often, right? And that incident leads to the beginning of kind of leadership emerging, then some kind of organizational apparatus, then some constantation where there's either confrontation or where there's just contention, and then a social movement generally takes form. It either is adapted or it is squashed or something. So if we borrow that model of how social movements rise and then how they fall from us, there have been many successes of women's social movement, and I want to name 3. And let's talk about that.
Absolutely.
All right. So from a standpoint of a sociologist, we want to look at, have there been moments in which women have mobilized? And we know this is an absolute fact that women have mobilized in other social movements. So you have the role of women in the abolitionist movement in this country.
Absolutely.
Women have been involved in the labor movement in this country. They may not have led it, but they were involved. And what is very interesting is, in terms of mobilization, is that the movement of women who have been challenging racism, and for that matter, anti-Semitism. Women have been mobilizing to push forth those images. So that's one of the successful things, is that women have been part of the apparatus for mobilization.
And right now, I think this is actually one of the political moments of contention that I see. So many young women in particular are coming into a moment of change. And they're envisioning a greater role for themselves and for their daughters, right? And they really see the potential for significant social advancement. In doing that, the tools, right, the tools that they're using have to be commensurate with the task ahead.
Absolutely.
And so this idea, for example, people come together. There's some kind of spark that brings people together. They have a common grievance. They realize it. They create some leaders. They create at least the outline and organizational structure. And I think a lot of those steps right now are not always being fully embraced.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of people who want to run really fast and far, but they're not building the capacities that they need for long-term enduring success.
We call that strategies or tactics that are like a fish out of water. Right? That you're mobilizing, you're asking people to participate in strategies that are going to undermine the larger goals that you have. Right?
And you could see this, for example, the very public fighting between leaders of the Women's March, which is such a sad, such a sad manifestation of where some of these difficulties are emerging right now. But the kind of combination of new media strategies and the call-out culture that's kind of been embraced by many people as both as a tool for social change, but also potentially as a tool to fragment the group further.
And all this Karen and Betty, and all this inner fighting, it's gotten ridiculous. It is not going to keep us on the task right?
That's right. And by facilitating such regular, normalized conversation outside of tightly bonded, well-conceptualized organizational structures, it's hard to resolve those conflicts.
Absolutely.
And so, like, one of the things I often talk to people about in terms of, you know, what to do when you want to make change. I think you have a few different options, but one of them is to get involved in existing structures and kind of change institutions from within,
right.
Which is a vitally important role, though it is perhaps less exciting, absolutely fraught with, there are going to be some terrible moments in some existing institutions. But the other option in my mind is to create some sort of structured organization. Individuals loosely bound together rarely have the staying power that you need to actually, you know, move through that entire cycle and achieve the change that you're looking for.
Well, that leads to the second strength of women's role in social movements,
right.
Whether they're leading them or whether they make up the majority. Certainly, the civil rights movement, for an example, women made up the majority of the civil rights movement, starting with African American women and larger groups of women. But the second strength of women's movement has to do with they bring their own resources to those movements. And those resources are not always money.
No.
Sometimes it's the food.
Sometimes it's the connections, the sense of community,
there you go.
The food.
Right. They bring the grandparents.
They
mobilize the guys. I always tell the story of at Spelman College, which is the premier black women's institution, mostly had a large number of middle-class African-American women since the establishment of the college. But they talk about how they wanted to change medical services to the rural women in Georgia. And so they took their father's cars that they had, can you imagine, in that 1913, 1920, and they took their father's cars, because it would have been their father's, and many of them had learned to drive, and they went out to the rural area and they brought nursing and medical supplies to those communities. Do you know that the ambulatory movement in this country accredits the experience of African American women for doing that before we had ambulatorial services throughout this country? Because certainly they did that at a time when America was racially segregated.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
So that we know that therefore the strength is, what are the things that you bring to a social movement? And women bring unique, specific things. This idea that social movements only have to be the loudest voice, or it has to be the person that pays the biggest amount of money.
No, usually the people who are most important in the social movements are the ones that you never see in front of the cameras, right? They're doing the tireless work of creating tight structures of people and kind of building that sense of camaraderie and simple logistics. Right?
I remember in the 60s, I was up all night using I know you young people don't know, but we had a mimeograph machine, and our hands used to be green the next morning because it meant that we were using that, or blue, ink was on it. I mean, But in contrast, for example, many of the organizing meetings for the women marches around the country, they haven't had that kind of invested base of people. So I think one of the things that we need to be aware of as we move into moments of political change is the recognition that, first of all, you don't have to be the voice out front. You don't have to be the one tweeting every day. There are so many ways to get involved, but also fragmenting is not helpful. Right? And so finding ways to embrace difference, not just difference in terms of identity, right? Race, class, religion, and but simple opinion. People have different approaches and they have different goals. And so I think that we need to be very mindful of accepting other women and recognizing that just because we're all women, we can have widely divergent perspectives. Count on it.
And that can be one of the strengths of the movement, but you need to embrace it. And you need to, instead of using it as a tool to divide, you need to use it as a tool to unite.
Absolutely. I would say that leads to another strength of women's social movements, And that has to do with, because women understood that the personal is political and that the intimate is also ideological.
Absolutely.
That they begin to realize that any involvement in a social movement meant that you brought your baggage, your cultural baggage to that movement.
That's right.
And that you had to do some political work, some personal work, right?
Right.
How about you examine why you don't understand how your own privilege works?
Yeah.
Or maybe look at the power dynamics in your family, because your father is deciding what you study in college because they're paying the purse strings, and all of the other dynamics. I think of the personal work I had to do in Black movement organizations when I realized that many of the men were sexist, and how that was problematic. Or I had to look at the kind of class dynamics when I went away to community college and really experienced for the first time in my life being around people who were very wealthy, and how inadequate I felt, and how like I was an imposter, trying to be, quote, in college. So this is the dynamic of some of that personal work. And I think that's one of the strengths that women bring to social movements, because we have men who have been impacted by these social movements and other gendered experiences.
That's right.
And they have to ask themselves, what is the privilege they bring to that situation, and unpackage that in order not to have that interfere with the work that we're all doing, right?
That's exactly right. Yep, and we all have to do that work. I mean, I remember distinctly, I went to a women's college, having no expectation of what that personal project was going to mean for me. And I'll be perfectly honest and say, I'm not sure I know why I went to a women's college. It was not an intentional decision on my part, strangely, because the experience really is so different from most college experiences. And it really does, spending time with women, not as competitors, not as, kind of part of a hierarchy of relative privilege, right? But recognizing that you're all coming for a common purpose. And while that project is individual, it is also collective.
Absolutely.
And so sharing your individual self with the collective goal is a tough thing to do. And you have to really be able to bring some humility and some very genuine reflection into that process.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
And I think a lot of women have never fully, that's an ongoing project for me. I think it's an ongoing project for
Certainly
most
for
people.
Me. Absolutely.
You can have key moments where you realize it, but you certainly, it's something that never stops, right? You have to be willing to do the work always.
Well, another strengths of women involved in social movements have been the way in which women in the last half of the 20th century have been able to put their money where their mouths are. So some of the longest standing organizations have been funded by people from previous generations to continue to do the work. And so we see, as women have entered professional work and work outside of the home, which has been one of the great accomplishments since World War II, is that women have made more money, and then they get to determine where the heck that money is going. And that money is going to do the work that they realize that they were a beneficiary of. By the way, that old question, are you a feminist? That's irrelevant. What I want to say is, whether you believe you are or not, you benefited from the activities of somebody who saw themselves as feminists and made institutional and policy changes. So this very strength of these women to say, you know what, when I die and we all pass out of here, I'm leaving my resources to this organization. This has been another strength of women's social movements.
That's absolutely
organizations.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the things that, as we move forward, and I think a lot of people are looking at this particular period of time in American politics, and they're excited to see women coming together and being perhaps more thoughtful, more aware of the legacy that they are living now, right? Where that legacy comes from. I see more and more people embracing that idea that women have a unique role to bring to this political moment. And a responsibility.
Absolutely.
And so I think that is both gratifying, but I think it can also yield a bit of tension sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. One good example would be Another contribution of women's movements, involvement in social movements, have been a standard of ethics.
Yes.
Like, how do I have to behave to put my best foot forward? And again, that's that place of tension, right? Because certainly if our politics have to represent our personal, then, you know, we want to bring our kindness and our thoughtfulness and all of those things. But if it also represents our political stances, then we have to be open-minded and broad enough to embrace that.
That's right.
That means we've got to have critical listening skills.
Yep.
And I think in many ways women have brought that forth with this idea of realizing that, guess what? There might be more than one reality.
Imagine
that. There might be more than one opinion. Imagine that. Like, there's no, just because science says there's only one reality, there might be other levels of reality. There might be different levels of knowledge.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah.
So I think this has been one of the other kind of exciting ways in which women's participation, leadership, creation of organizations like the Chrysalis organization was founded by Louise Noun, an organization that she left her money to, and it has been existing for an extremely long time, thank goodness.
And doing exceptional work.
Exceptional work. So these are examples of, and they have a standard. They say 4 girls, 4 women. I think the sign says forever. So, I mean, clearly it has a direction. I think another strong contribution of women's social movements is that they have stayed on the task.
Yes.
My grandmother used to say from the South, you know, I held my row to the end. They have pathways. And in many ways, they're not necessarily competitive, right? They could be. But they're also realize that those pathways are to continue the work. And that work continues.
And this is one of the great things about this political moment. You
Yes.
do see young women stepping up and getting involved in a way that even 10 years ago I did not see.
Right.
And so it's not, you know, it's not the case that we have a small group of young women who are saying, I'm a feminist, I'm going to go do this.
Right.
You know, I'm always a little bit troubled and yet oddly gratified by the number of young women who I hear say, I'm not a feminist, but, right?
Then what's their practice, right? Well,
exactly.
like, what are they doing?
I'm not a feminist, but. I'm like,
But.
no, I think actually you are embracing the very notion of feminism, and you're doing it in a way that it feels right for you.
Well, that's why there's so many right now currently
right.
mutual, what they call in sociology, mutual aid groups emerging.
Yep.
I mean, just the idea that we don't have enough masks, right?
Right.
I mean, what are the groups of people that are coming together across differences in any small communities that they're in and making 1,000 of these and making them available in their community.
That's right.
By the way, I come from Grinnell, Iowa. We have 9,102 people, and we have one regional hospital, and there are 2 groups that are making masks for everybody in that town. Now, that is not feminism is the way that we think about it as the top, and they're engaging the powers that be. But that is the strength of women in social movements, is that you do activism where you are.
That's right.
Right? Mm-hmm. And doing it where you are is significant too.
Yes. And recognizing it in your own households and your own, in your own immediate communities, while at the same time being able to translate that into a broader set of understandings of people who are not nearby, geographically proximate to you.
Right. When we take a stand on an issue in Grinnell, Iowa, and that stand is met by people who are taking a stand in Guatemala, or in Jordan, or in Israel, or in Accra, Ghana, or in South Africa, or in Brazil, then that is that invisible link, but it's not really so invisible anymore, right?
Right.
Because it is pushing those boundaries, right? And it gathers strength. So I would think that's another way in when women's participation in social movement, another strength is that we are not standing alone, right? That we are standing with our cultural differences, for our cultural differences, towards an issue that is impactful to all of us.
And I think one of the unique roles that we have, particularly those of us who do have incredible privilege in our immediate communities, but also certainly from a global perspective, we have this, I think, really unique opportunity to step up and inject these issues into a public conversation.
Yes.
And
Oh, you mean we might add some agenda points?
imagine.
Oh, imagine that. Okay, imagine that.
But certainly, having just gone through a caucus cycle, when I
Yes.
see people stand up and talk about the concerns of women in their immediate communities,
Yes.
but also women around the world,
Yes.
I think that's tremendously important to recognize ourselves as people, whether we're part of an organized social movement or not, whether we're a leader of a social movement or not, whether we consider ourselves to be part of any sort of formalized, structured experience of a movement or not. Each of us in our everyday experiences, I think, has a responsibility to bring these issues into our conversations with our political leaders at every level of government. And here in Iowa,
Right.
of course, we have this great opportunity to bring our issues into a national conversation.
Absolutely. I remember the experience of Laura Bush, who went to a West African country, and she was so overwhelmed with the needs of the women in the villages that she met. And somebody asked her, "What did you come to teach us to do? Not what your opinion is."
Right.
And she said, "Canning." And the next thing she did is she was showing them how to can. She started a grassroots organization in her hometown in Texas to raise money to continue to teach them. And you know what? It's that old saying, teach somebody how to do something,
right.
and it lasts for a long
Forever.
time. Forever,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So sometimes the very activism comes out of our very lives.
Yeah,
Our very
and sometimes
lives.
these very personal issues can matter.
Absolutely.
I remember a college student standing up and asking Bill Richardson, when he was a presidential candidate, about what his position was on the HPV vaccine. And he very honestly, to his great credit, he very honestly said, "I don't know, and so I'm going to have to do some research on that issue.
Oh,
Would you
wow.
be willing to stay and talk to me about this?"
That's wonderful.
And I mean, these are these small moments where somebody who can think that they don't have a lot of power in a national conversation, they can raise issues of concern to women in a very direct and unfiltered way. And I think that's so important
That's
to be able
fantastic.
to do. It's easy, I think, to for most people right now, it's pretty easy to go on Facebook and post your displeasure about something.
Sure.
But actually going out and putting an issue on the agenda and making that effort, I think, is so critical to that interpersonal dynamic that's ultimately going to be more successful.
I think another strength of women in social movements and women either leading them or the organizations or just the broader national and international leadership, I think another strength has to do with the way in which they bring new words, new concepts to the experience. So for an example, we talk about intersectionality, Professor Crenshaw's famous 1986 concept in which she says that none of us have just one identity. Exactly. We have multiple identities. Well, we can see today that the trans movement, say for an example, has been a movement which has adapted this idea because they have multiple identities, sexual identities, gendered identities, class identities, educational experiences, and so forth. So I think that we have generated a language that gives us a chance to understand our own experience as an individual, and I like what you said, the collective, because we can't ever forget the collective, right?
We're all part of something bigger.
Absolutely.
And we should also, to your point, we're not just part of one something bigger.
No.
Right? We're part of a lot of something bigger.
Absolutely.
And so kind of figuring out how to navigate that very complicated terrain can be important, but allowing for opportunities to express that experience is absolutely essential. Intersectionality, of course, right? It's always existed.
Absolutely.
But anytime...
But if you didn't live it, then it wasn't pertinent to you, right?
That's right.
And it became pertinent to women,
when
right?
we can create a way to talk about it in a, in a new way.
Right.
We're giving it new language, but the experience is not necessarily new, right?
We don't want to punish people for the intersections that they live.
Not
we
at all.
want to just use that as an example to say, I think I can understand that particular way that you are excluded because I'm excluded in a different way, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's a tool.
It brings common cause, right?
Absolutely.
It can bring common cause.
So let's shift this conversation
Yeah.
just a little bit and say, in the movements that you may have been in, or organizational, social movement organizations, or even if you've led a social movement of any kind, whether I would say a social movement event, let's say it like that.
Yes.
What have been some of the strengths that you brought to it, and what have been the places where it rubbed wrong for you?
I'm a logistics person. Let's
Okay.
start there.
All right.
I'm very much the person who's not in front of the camera,
Got
who's
it.
not tweeting, who's not.
Okay.
But I think this is one of the things that I've realized. It's one of my strengths,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Is the ability to kind of knuckle down, get it done, like the tedious, the frustrating stuff that I think any event has to have,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
I was at the Women's March in Washington, so and it called to mind, and one of my other thoughts is that I think there's an eye for detail and an eye for longevity
Yes.
that is essential, that at least in that instance I felt was kind of missing. Nobody was collecting names or contact information for the women at the Women's March. I didn't
Yes.
encounter anybody who was collecting information, and when I asked somebody about it, they said, well, everybody's on Facebook. And I said, well, I'm not. I don't spend time on Facebook. I'm not part
yes.
of your Facebook group. So,
So there's the strength that you brought, but you also see, you can spotlight where the
and
tensions
there's
were.
a strategic,
Yes.
right, a way of thinking politically about building capacity.
Yes.
And building capacity that's going to serve an organization well over the long term, whether
That's
that's institutionalizing some practices, whether that's ensuring that you're getting good people to do exactly what they're good at.
Right. Key.
And kind of navigating some difference and disagreements, having a strong sense of purpose, but at the same time recognizing that this isn't only about you, right? This is about a broader set of goals.
Let me turn that question on myself.
Yeah, I was going to say, what about you?
Oh my goodness. So I have been one of those people that have been in front of social movement activities or events. And I've also been involved in social movements since early on. And I've been involved in social movements when I was the youngest person in the room.
Yep.
And when I was probably the oldest person in the room. And I think my strengths, because I have been trained as an academic, is to be able to contextualize, and as you and I talked about, what's the history here?
Exactly.
What is the history?
What's the history? What can I bring? What's
Absolutely.
new about this or different about this?
Right.
And that context matters a great deal. It's a form of institutional memory.
Absolutely.
Right? What has worked in the past? What can work in the future?
I mean, I think this is one of the things I've enjoyed in being at 67 in this age in my life, and seeing the power of young people to ask very profound questions, but they got to root those.
Yes.
And, like, have we done that before? What is the strategy going to use? Are your tactics going to flow from sort of an analysis? Is it linked to your larger goal, and so forth? But I think where it has rubbed for me, where it still continues to be difficult, is that because of education, I acquired so much privilege.
That's right.
And therefore, I don't necessarily represent those communities that are still excluded. I might want to say that, I'm from Iowa, and I am, because I've lived here now more than 30-some years.
It's amazing how that happens.
Right, I'm an Iowan now. I'm originally
It's a
from
critical
Detroit.
moment where we become Iowans.
Well, I'm an Iowan. But the thing is, you know what? I'm not standing in line for food.
Right.
Right? What communities do I say that I'm really representing? And I think the politics of the 60s was really a politic of people stepping out of their community and talking to those people in a militant form, maybe, of, fix this.
Right.
But I think we're living in a very difficult time, because defining community is what now? Who are the people that you live around, the people that you share the similar ideas, the kind of activism you're involved.
Right.
It's different. It's
It is.
very, very different.
And I think one of the difficulties right now, and this kind of brings it back to Iowa, but also in, those of us who live and work in cities or
Yes.
academic communities, I think sometimes we take our privilege for granted. The
Absolutely.
fact that not only are we, perhaps well-educated and perhaps fairly well-paid.
Yeah, fairly.
Right? Fairly well-paid, relatively. But when we overlay our kind of personal privilege on top of some of the broader structural and political questions that the country is going through right now, I think we often forget that even within Iowa, right, all you got to do is go a few miles and you will find communities that have been economically just devastated for various reasons. And so I think we sometimes, particularly in this political moment where so much of our conversation basically breaks down to rural versus urban, right? There's this rural versus urban divide, which is often expressed in terms of racial resentment, or often expressed in terms of economic anxiety, or often expressed in terms of educational attainment, or whatever it may be. I think we do really well to allow ourselves to go talk to people who have experiences different than ours. And that may include political experiences.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Like understanding that different communities have different strengths, and different communities have different challenges. And so, you know, I always think about a couple of the events that I went to during the 2016 campaign where I spoke with people in more rural areas of the state. And they have a very different perception of what kinds of change they're looking for. Right?
And it may be similar, but the strategies might be different. And where it's different, we might learn a broader lesson, right?
Strategically, finding the overlap, finding the point of agreements, the points of agreement is, in my mind, just a really big project that many people are not engaging directly right now. But it's such an opportunity. And I think it could be such an exciting opportunity to find out where those points of agreement are, where values align, where our hopes and dreams for the future align.
I think that if we're moving away from a kind of a notion of our community is where I live to a community of intention, then we can be in multiple communities of resistance. And I think that's another strength of women in social movements. Certainly privileged women during slavery being involved in the abolitionist movement, what was an example of them using their privilege in the best way they could to end slavery. Or those women who used their privilege to try to institute the IRA. This is the ERA, is extremely important. They were using it, although simultaneously they were excluding African American women, but that's another one of those issues, right? But the fact is that, again, I think one of the larger lessons and strengths is that women have modeled for other women now. We're not living on the steam of just the firsts anymore. We're living on the steams of the critical mass of women that are now in these systems where they have changed the agendas. There's more than one bathroom. It's not all men, right? There are more than, one way of talking about science and teaching science, with the STEM and women and all of these technologies. And I love this. I mean, if there's ever been a reason to identify in all the things that we define as woman, whatever that is, and it can be as broad as we want it to be, I think we're living in a fantastic moment. But women involved in social movements have made that happen.
That's right.
Right? Because that is where change takes place.
And finding ways to identify that legacy. I mean, it's interesting to me the number of people who are active in some social movement related to the advancement of women, but really are not fully appreciative of what has come before. And that's something you learn over time. But it also, I think, requires a good deal of appreciation for the people and the places, and reflection on how you came to be able to occupy the role that you occupy today.
I wrote a book called The Habit of Surviving, and it was actually chronicalizing the experience of women who were born in the 30s, raised in the 40s, and became parents in the 50s. That would be my mother's generation. And when I finished the book, I remember touring with the book, and I remember saying to the publisher, "You don't have me touring anywhere in Iowa." So she sent me to What Cheer, Iowa.
Very nice. By the way, best name in the state of Iowa.
What Cheer, Iowa.
Shout out to What Cheer.
And I went to this, they sent me to this place where, I think it was a senior citizen community. And what was really interesting is I was supposed to do like I had done in all the other cities that I had visited. I was to read a section of the book and then, have a Q&A. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I have nothing in common with these women.
What is this going to look like?
But I did it. But let me tell you, one of the most interesting conversations began when a woman who stood up, and she had to be in her 80s, late 80s, and she said, honey, I had that habit of surviving too. And she went on to tell me about her experience in World War II, trying to keep the economy of her community together while men were at service. And I tell you, it moved me to tears because I could see parallels. So that's another one of the strengths of women in social movements, is that we have brought our parallels with each other, of our similarities and of experiences. It's not just our differences. It's also our similarities. So that I could hear that woman saying, I was canning with my mother in the same way that I later canned food, those pears in the backyard with my grandmother. So there's many, many similarities. And that is the heartfelt part of knowing women's history and social movements and being leaders in their community. Because this woman went on to talk about how she had to challenge her brother who was doing something. And I was like, oops, woo. I was very impressed. What Cheer Iowa? Will never
What
forget
Cheer
that in my
Iowa?
life.
Again, shout out to What Cheer. I'm wondering, just to sort of shift gears a little bit, we're in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about global social movements. We're talking about the role of women, how to advance the role of women. What are your thoughts on what this brings to light? And does it pose any unique hurdles or any unique opportunities that we can learn from?
I think two. One is that COVID and the 19 and the pandemic has done something that has never happened in human history before. It shut the world down.
It did.
And when there have been world wars, sections of the world have shut down, but there have been places where it hasn't shut down. This has been an equal opportunity change agent for everybody. The other thing is that it has spotlighted the cracks in everybody's society.
Yes, I would agree with
Everybody's
that.
home, everybody's relationships, about what's not feeling so good and what's not going so well, right? Including our kids, our parents, our relatives,
Division
our
of responsibilities.
There you
Who's
go.
doing laundry and
There
dishes
you
and
go.
childcare on an everyday basis. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Well, it has spotlighted in ways where, because we do learn to live with a certain level of kind of uncomfortableness for the larger project of staying in unity, right? But I think we now have to see that our leaders in certain spectrums have certain ideas collectively. When, for example, Putin's idea might be similar to somebody's ideas in India, right? Like, we say, well, how did that happen, right? And although I'm calling out names here, my point is that this spotlighting is forcing us to be global in ways that we hadn't thought about, because we know that nations are responding to this COVID-19 pandemic in ways that are more progressive in some areas and less progressive in others. And that makes us have to compare and contrast in ways that we didn't before.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, it's really highlighting, as you said, a lot of the difference between rhetoric and reality in a lot of people's lives, right?
Yes.
And so understanding, for example, that so much of home health care and nursing home care and hospital workers, those are still disproportionately women.
Right,
And they are disproportionately women of color.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so
that might be the only jobs they can get?
Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
Right? But so many women who didn't sign up to be emergency responders, but they're now on the front lines of something. And really, for so many women, forced to keep those jobs and keep working as an economic necessity.
Right.
Right.
And that's right. And in contrast, we might create a policy in America called shelter in place.
Right.
Tell me how the heck that's going to happen in a place where you have multi-generations, you have a large number of people, say in a South African ex-apartheid situation where people are going to be able to shelter in place. You got to have an individual house to shelter in place. So it shows, by contrast, this COVID moment it shows us that privilege is also about the nation state we find ourselves living in. And I live in America,
That's right.
where there's an extreme privilege. I am part of the 1 billion people in the world where the other percentages of the world don't live in an advanced capitalist society, right?
Yep.
So it's a big contrast.
Yeah. And I think, to your point as well, I think it also really highlights the interesting evolution of the role of capital itself.
Yes.
That, in prior eras, I think shutting down the world was about shutting down political power or military power.
Right.
And in today's world, shutting down the world is shutting down economic relationships.
Right, absolutely.
Which I think is a telling shift in terms of how we conceptualize relative power around the world, who possesses it, right? Like, clearly, Jeff Bezos is doing just fine.
Right, right, absolutely. And we are now in a situation where when you don't know whether your neighbor feels a certain way about that sign that says, my freedom is more important than your safety.
Right.
And you don't know which of your neighbors wants to carry that sign or is carrying that sign, and what is that going to mean for the relationship that you've had with them, and what is that going to mean for the relationship moving forward. By the way, I met some powerful, fabulous women who are brilliant, but I'm a little concerned about what their ideas might be now, because that brilliance and that powerfulness and their organizational skills and the organizations they belong to and the privileges that they have, how are those things going to have a larger project for more than just them? That's a little scary to me.
Yeah. I think it's a unique political moment for
Yes.
sure. I think it's demonstrating a lot of, we keep hearing that it's the great equalizer in so many respects, but in many respects it's doing exactly the opposite, right? I mean, it's really calling our attention to the unequal parts.
We're going to get in trouble by saying that.
Which
The inequalities? Oh my
imagine.
God! Oh my God! Ooh, we're going to get in trouble.
If anybody were to, I think it'll reorganize a lot of social relationships.
Yes.
It'll reorganize a lot of political thinking, and form a new agenda going forward. In some ways, we're going to be aware of some things that maybe we weren't fully aware of in the past.
I mean, one of the ways that privileges has operated is that you don't have to own something that's impacting others.
Right.
And we know that privilege always happens at the expense of someone else.
That's right.
So it's very interesting that now many of us have to be ideologically outed, right?
Right.
And that has not been the case. You could hide behind so many things, but now people are asking, what do you think? What are you doing? And what is this going to mean for our relationship? And I think this is where the personal is political and the intimate is very personal and political today.
Yes,
Yeah.
it really is. It's posing all sorts of unique new dynamics that I think social movements for years to come, we're going to look back on this period of time as a time of tremendous kind of change and informing the way we move forward.
Absolutely.
So we have a question.
Okay.
And that is, what role does propaganda play in disrupting movements?
Well, all state machineries have propaganda, because the very nature of a state mechanism, you're going to talk about this more than me, but the very role of a state mechanism is to maintain social order, right? And that if there is change, then you institutionalize how people can make a change, vote, protest, write a letter, or all of those things. That's good.
Yep.
But propaganda is not something that in our society that we try to control. So propaganda can be ideological, propaganda can be outside of the system, propaganda can be inside of the system, and then there's, of course, the party line. So I think we're living in a moment now where we're seeing some of the uglier faces of kind of propaganda. We might say white supremacy, for an example, but we're going to also see some of the aspects of propaganda where you just see people that are choosing not to be involved, and they're personalizing their lives, and they're only talking about their needs, and they're not showing that they're connected. I saw this post that said, I want my nails done, and the picture right next to it was of an African American person saying, I just want to feed my kids, right? So we saw whiteness in terms of that privilege, and we saw an example of somebody showing that, you know, aren't we historically the first to be, last to be hired and the first to be fired? Or, for an example, in my community, just this week, we had a silent solidarity walk in our community for the Avery family. So you have a young man who goes out to jog, and you see a white male who's jogging, but a black person who's jogging is a threat. So I'm saying that we're seeing in many ways how propaganda is, we all are capable of it. It isn't just a state machinery, right? And I think when we think of Hitler, we think of this horrible propaganda, but I think there are many kinds of propaganda.
I would absolutely agree with that.
Corporations extend their own
corporate propaganda,
don't they?
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I would agree there are so many different kinds of propaganda to consider. And in some ways, we have all become mini propagandists.
Yes, yes.
Right? We all have our Twitter feeds, we all have our Facebook timelines and what have you. So we get to shape our own conception of our own lives and try to convince others of whatever it is that we want them to believe, which is kind of an interesting, you know, I hear people now casually talk about their Facebook brand.
Right.
People in everyday lives. That wouldn't be that wouldn't be consistent with my Facebook brand. And I was like,
absolutely.
So we're all branding ourselves now in interesting ways. I think one of the interesting things for social movements is the degree to which nation states are becoming much more effective in how they produce propaganda, particularly when we're talking about social movements that are being propagated through social media and virtual networks.
Right.
And it's what they're doing is not necessarily putting out directly contradictory information, right? Nor are they necessarily shutting down communications among activists. What many, you know, and there were certainly examples early on in the Arab Spring, for example, when governments would just shut down social media, turn off the internet, which of course in the United States we wouldn't even think is possible, but as this very extreme reaction. And that's not the way that nation states are going to combat social change anymore. Increasingly, they are either pumping out so much distracting information that it simply makes us question what we know.
Absolutely.
And when no one can agree on what the facts are, then it just becomes a haze of competing claims that we can't navigate effectively. And so that's actually become an incredibly effective way to think about propaganda, is not as a single party line from the government, but instead as this mix, this morass of junk, that we can't cognitively sort through easily.
Well, you have the junk, but then you also have the exclusion. So for an example, one of the largest political assassinations numerically that are happening in the world today are happening in Brazil, happening against women who are grassroots organizing for environmental issues. Like, how come we don't know their names? How come their names are not household names? Because they're being excluded from the news feed. So you got both. You got the junk, like
the algorithms,
right?
Like,
there you go.
All those algorithms, and people think the algorithms are neutral in their application. They're not.
They're not.
They are embedded within existing systems of privilege and understanding of what is authoritative or important in our national discourse.
That was a great question.
That was a great question.
I like that. Thank you, whoever asked that.
So we have another question coming in, which is, what do you see coming in the methods of movements, and how can we prepare for that? How are movement methods going to change?
Well, I think we've alluded to some of them, and that is that there's going to be more virtual organizing, and people are going to be held more accountable to that virtuality, I would say. I do think I just made that word up, but what I really mean is that
it's not virtuousness.
Well, I mean, you got people that because they can assume an identity and they can type whatever they want, they think they're not going to be held accountable. And I think that there's a greater amount of accountability that's going to happen. I mean, you got Facebook themselves saying you can't say hate speeches, you can't say that. So I think that we would never have predicted that was going to happen. But I think a second method is going to be that people will assume that they've got to communicate both ways. They've got to have some virtual activism, but you can't just make that your only activism. I'll pay $5 and then I've done my stuff, right? But you also have to be really involved with human beings, right?
Yes.
You have to, how does that translate into who it is that you're coalescing with? And then the third part is, who are you representing? Who are you servicing? That the spirit of America is really, interesting enough, the spirit of service. So who are you servicing, right? And you certainly aren't doing the revolution for them. You're also part of it, right? So you're not an elite practitioner for them, that you're actually involved in that issue that you're involved with.
Yeah. And in terms of my own, how I think about methods going forward, I'm seeing a number of, first of all, I think individuals in some ways have greater power today than they would have envisioned possible 15 years ago, right? And in some cases, I think that has made them incredibly effective advocates.
Right.
And in other cases, I think it has made them actually not very effective advocates. The empowering of the individual. Movements are about the collective.
Right.
Inherently, it has to be bigger than yourself.
Right.
And so when you kind of use these networks of communication as a way to promote your view over all others, I think you actually end up undermining your fundamental goal.
Yeah, you're prioritizing your story and thinking that is the dominant, and unless it's this one, I'm not going to be involved.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
How effective is that?
Yeah. So, I mean, and this may simply be restating your idea that you ended on, but I think one of the most important things in terms of how do we prepare for this, most important things is we need to realize that this is about human relationships.
Absolutely.
And so forming those human relationships is incredibly important. One of the big trends that we're already seeing is that there is an ideological ethos behind so many of these movements that are popping up online that really values egalitarianism in an extreme sense, which means that there are no leaders. By design, there are no leaders. And
we also know what has happened historically to movement leaders when they don't make it in the society. Anything from assassinates them, imprisons them, defames them.
Leaderlessness is in some ways a real advantage, right? But in other ways, it's a real disadvantage.
Right.
And it makes it difficult for groups to negotiate.
Yes.
It makes it difficult for groups to resolve disputes. It makes it difficult for groups to decide on coherent long-term strategies. And so I think that leaderlessness is something that we're going to continue to see. How do we prepare for it? I think we have to be ready to accept that collectively some form, even weak leadership, is sometimes preferable. And so that agility in planning, I think, becomes really important.
I like the Poor People's Movement, which is primarily mostly women, with Reverend Barber, but he's not the only person that's part of it. They have a leadership committee, and they project all of the people that are involved in that. And I think that would be one of my examples. We have multiple leaders. I know young people are very appreciative of learning about what leaders of particular movements have done in the second half of the 20th century, but they also they're looking at a different model.
Yeah,
right?
they are.
And I
That's
think
exactly right.
That makes sense.
Yes. We have a final question.
Oh, okay.
Which is, how can we help girls and young women learn that they have power?
Oh my goodness, we don't have enough time.
We don't have enough time for
that. Are you kidding me? Well, first of all, if nobody looks like them are doing what we're asking them to do, then there's a contradiction.
Yes.
Right? So one, we have to make ourselves as leaders something that people are attracted to and not promote ourselves, right, as leaders.
That's right.
But it has to be that. So that would be one place I'd start.
Yep.
What about you?
Well, I think one of the things, when I think back on my own my own evolution as a young woman.
Got it.
I think one of the most important things that taught me that I was important and that I had an important role to play was the ability to sit down and talk to other women on a regular basis and understand what they had been doing. But then along the way, also learning about some of that history, about the remarkable women who have come before. you need to kind of balance the desire for personal expression and growth alongside that idea of being part of something bigger than yourself.
I'm going to add 2 quick things.
Okay.
One is you have to be able to demonstrate appreciation.
Yes, and humility.
Right? And humility. Well, you got my word. Because, if you cannot realize that people did the best they could do in the time they were in,
that's right.
then you're not going to be willing to be open to the history, and you might be trying to imitate the same strategies and tactics that won't work for this time.
Yep.
So I think there has to be some appreciation, right? I stepped on someone else's back.
That's right.
For me to be in this place. I think both of us are in this room.
And now it's time for someone else.
Right, lay that back down.
Lift up the next person.
So I think young girls who will become young women, who will become, one day, women leaders in all the capacities they find themselves, they have to also talk about that history of kindness, that history of appreciation. And I want that. Without that, we're going to have a bunch of people moving around like atoms, not connected to, and we already know the weaknesses of that.
I think that's exactly right. That's our final thought, I think. You just summed it up very nicely.
Well,
Thank
I want
you.
to say one more. It has been wonderful to be with you.
It has been a delightful experience.
That's right.
Thank you for taking the time to be here today without a mask.
That's right. We had to take off these masks. But you know what? It just shows that we could create synergy by our varied experience. And I learned from your strength. And you gave me a lot of hope today, and I appreciate this
so much fun
opportunity.
So
Thanks,
much fun.
Chrysalis, for inviting us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Rachel Payne Caulfield, Dr. Keisho Scott, for giving us a thought-provoking and meaningful conversation about women, women's movements, and what it's taken to achieve what we've achieved today. On behalf of the Chrysalis Foundation, I thank you for joining us. Chrysalis Conversations depends on you. We're happy that you were able to join us this year. We hope you'll plan to be with us for the 2020 Inspired event, October 9th at the downtown Hilton, where we'll be hosting Sunny Hostin, who is co-host of ABC's popular morning show, The View, and former prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice. We look forward to seeing you then and wishing you all the best from the Chrysalis Foundation.